On a rainy night, the isolated mansion remains silent as a rich man leads the young woman into the dark basement. Dizzy, she falls onto the damp floor just as the door closes behind her. Outside, a German shepherd growls and scratches at the wood. Through the cracks, a rat appears and disappears into the shadows. The man goes up the stairs without looking back. In the distance, heavy footsteps echo through an old tunnel. But what broke the silence right after? No one there was expecting it. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. The moment Emily Parker stepped out of the taxi, she felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her shoulders. The sprawling estate stretched before her like something from a Gothic novel, all stone towers and ivy-covered walls set against the backdrop of the Colorado Rockies. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds, making the mansion appear even more imposing than it had in the photographs Mr. Thornton had shown her during their brief interview in Denver. "You sure you want me to leave you here, miss?" the taxi driver asked, eyeing the property with obvious unease. "It's a long way back to town, and cell service gets spotty up in these mountains." Emily clutched her worn duffel bag tighter and forced a smile. "I'll be fine, thank you." She handed him the fare plus a modest tip, all she could afford after the long journey from Kansas. This job was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to finally leave behind the string of disappointments that had defined her life so far. As the taxi disappeared down the winding mountain road, Emily turned to face her new reality. The job posting had been vague but promising. Household assistant needed for distinguished gentlemen, competitive salary, room and board included. After months of unemployment and mounting bills, she hadn't been in a position to ask too many questions. The front door opened before she could even knock, revealing a tall man in his early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of expensive clothing that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Richard Thornton extended a perfectly manicured hand, his smile polished, but somehow never quite reaching his pale blue eyes. "Miss Parker, welcome to Thornton Manor. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" His voice carried the refined accent of someone who had attended the finest schools and moved in the most exclusive circles. "Not at all, Mr. Thornton. Thank you for this opportunity." Emily shook his hand, noting how his grip lingered just a moment longer than necessary, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Please come inside. I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties." He gestured toward the grand foyer with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandelier. Despite the obvious wealth on display, there was something cold about the space, as if warmth and laughter had been systematically removed from the very air. As they walked through the mansion, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floors, creating an almost musical rhythm that seemed to follow them from room to room. Mr. Thornton pointed out various areas with the detached efficiency of a museum guide. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, the conservatory, where morning light filtered through stained glass windows, the kitchen, with its industrial-grade appliances that seemed far too large for one person. "Your primary responsibilities will be maintaining the garden, organizing the library, and caring for Max," he explained as they climbed the curved staircase to the second floor. "Max is my German shepherd. He's quite particular about strangers, but I'm sure you'll manage to win him over." Emily's room was larger than her entire apartment back in Kansas, furnished with antiques that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past year. A tall window overlooked the rear gardens, where geometric hedges created intricate patterns. Around a central fountain, everything was beautiful, perfect even, but there was a sterile quality to it all that made her feel like she was living in a museum rather than a home. "Dinner is served at 7 sharp in the main dining room," Mr. Thornton informed her, his eyes once again lingering on her face with that unsettling intensity. "I prefer punctuality in all things, Miss Parker. I trust that won't be a problem." "Of course not, sir." "Excellent. I'll leave you to settle in." "Oh, and Miss Parker?" He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the ornate brass handle. "The east wing of the house is off limits. It's undergoing renovations, you understand. Safety concerns and all that." After he left, Emily sat on the edge of the 4-poster bed and tried to process her new surroundings. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the depths of the house. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her modest wardrobe in the walk-in closet that could have housed the belongings of 10 people. As evening approached, she made her way back downstairs, following the sound of classical music to the dining room. Mr. Thornton was already seated at the head of a table that could easily accommodate 20 people, reading what appeared to be financial documents while sipping wine from a crystal glass. "Ah, Miss Parker, punctual as promised." He gestured to the chair at his right, much closer than Emily would have preferred. "I hope you'll find the accommodations satisfactory." Dinner was an elaborate affair, prepared by what must have been a professional chef, though Emily never saw who had cooked the meal. The conversation was polite but strained, with Mr. Thornton asking seemingly innocent questions about her background, her family, her reasons for leaving Kansas. Each inquiry felt calculated, as if he were building a profile rather than making small talk. "You mentioned in your interview that you have no close family ties," he said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "That must make it easier to relocate for work." "I suppose it does." Emily pushed her food around her plate, her appetite diminished by the intensity of his attention. "I've always been pretty independent." Independence is an admirable quality, though it can sometimes lead to isolation. His smile was perfectly pleasant, but there was something predatory about the way he watched her reaction. "I hope you won't find it too lonely here. The mountains can be quite isolating, especially for someone accustomed to city life." That night, Emily lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. The wind whistled through the mountain peaks, creating an almost musical harmony that should have been soothing, but instead filled her with unease. She found herself thinking about the taxi driver's concern, about the way Mr. Thornton's eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance, about the mysterious East Wing that was supposedly under renovation. Sleep finally came, but it was restless and filled with dreams of long corridors and watching eyes. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through her window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For a moment, she almost convinced herself that her uneasiness had been nothing more than first-night jitters in a new place. That illusion lasted exactly as long as it took her to get dressed and make her way downstairs for breakfast. As she descended the main staircase, she heard a low, growling sound coming from somewhere near the kitchen. Following the sound, she discovered a magnificent German shepherd standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a service area. The dog was beautiful, with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that gleamed with health and good care. But what struck Emily most was the way he was watching her, his head tilted slightly as if he were trying to communicate something important. When she took a step closer, he didn't back away or show any signs of aggression. Instead, he seemed to study her with the same intensity that Mr. Thornton had displayed the night before, though somehow the dog's attention felt protective rather than predatory. "That's Max," came Mr. Thornton's voice from behind her, causing Emily to jump. She hadn't heard him approach, and the way he moved so silently through his own house added another layer to her growing unease. "He's usually not so friendly with strangers. You must have a way with animals." Emily knelt down slowly, extending her hand toward Max. The dog sniffed cautiously, then allowed her to stroke his head. His tail wagged once, tentatively, but his eyes never left Mr. Thornton's face. Even more interesting was the subtle change in the dog's posture when his owner was present, a tension that suggested wariness rather than the unconditional love. Most dogs showed their masters. "He's beautiful," Emily said, continuing to pet Max while observing the dynamic between dog and owner. "How long have you had him?" "Several years now. He came with the previous caretaker, actually. When she left, I decided to keep him." Mr. Thornton's tone was casual, but Emily noticed how Max's ears flattened slightly at the mention of his previous owner. "He's an excellent guard dog, very protective of the property." As if to prove the point, Max suddenly stiffened and moved to position himself between Emily and Mr. Thornton, his body language shifting to something that was unmistakably protective. The change was so subtle that Emily doubted Mr. Thornton, even noticed, but she felt the warmth of the dog's solid presence like a shield against something she couldn't quite name. "Well," Mr. Thornton said after a moment of uncomfortable silence, "I'll leave you to get acquainted. Your work schedule is on the kitchen counter. I'll be in my study most of the morning if you need anything." As he walked away, Emily could have sworn she heard Max release a small sigh of relief. Emily's first few days at Thornton Manor fell into a rhythm that was both comforting and unsettling. Her mornings began at dawn, when the Colorado mountains were painted in shades of rose and gold, and the air carried the crisp promise of alpine freshness. She would find Max waiting for her outside her bedroom door, as if he had appointed himself her personal guardian. The work itself was pleasant enough. The gardens were extensive and beautifully designed, with terraced levels that cascaded down, the mountainside like green waterfalls. Emily had always found peace in working with plants, and there was something therapeutic about pruning the rose bushes and tending to the herb garden that supplied the kitchen. Max would lie in the shade nearby, watching her work with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. What struck her as odd was how Max behaved differently depending on whether Mr. Thornton was around. When they were alone, the dog was relaxed and even playful, bringing her sticks to throw or simply enjoying having his ears scratched. But the moment Mr. Thornton appeared, Max would tense up, moving closer to Emily and watching his supposed master with a wariness that bordered on suspicion. "He's very attached to you already," Mr. Thornton commented one afternoon, finding Emily in the library, where she was cataloguing a collection of rare first editions. The room was magnificent, with its leather-bound volumes and antique reading chairs, but something about the way Mr. Thornton watched her as she worked made her skin crawl. "Dogs have good instincts about people," Emily replied, not looking up. From the inventory list she was creating, Max was lying at her feet, his presence a comfort she was beginning to depend on more than she cared to admit. "Indeed they do." Mr. Thornton moved closer, ostensibly to examine her work, but Emily could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. "You're very thorough, Miss Parker. I appreciate attention to detail." "Thank you, sir." Emily kept her voice professional, but she noticed how Max's ears perked up when Mr. Thornton stepped closer. The dog's body language was subtle but unmistakable, a readiness to intervene if necessary. "I trust you're finding everything you need. Your room is comfortable." "Very comfortable, thank you." "Excellent. I do want my employees to feel at home here." His smile was perfectly pleasant, but there was something calculating behind it that made Emily's instincts scream warnings. "Though I hope you understand the importance of discretion. What happens at Thornton Manor stays at Thornton Manor, if you know what I mean. Emily finally looked up, meeting his pale blue eyes directly. Of course, Mr. Thornton. I understand the value of privacy. I knew you would. He lingered a moment longer, his gaze traveling over her face and down to her hands before he finally moved away. Carry on with your excellent work. After he left, Emily realized she had been holding her breath. Max immediately stood up and nuzzled her hand, as if offering comfort. She scratched behind his ears, grateful for his steady presence. "What is it about him, boy?" she whispered. "What do you know that I don't?" That evening, Emily decided to explore more of the mansion. Her official duties kept her to certain areas, but curiosity was getting the better of her. The house was enormous, with corridors that seemed to wind endlessly through wings and annexes that had been added over the decades. Most of the rooms were elegantly furnished but felt unused, as if they were maintained for show rather than function. Max accompanied her on this informal tour, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When they reached the area near the east wing, the one Mr. Thornton had declared off-limits, Max's behavior changed dramatically. He stopped walking and began to whine softly, his eyes fixed on a doorway that was blocked by a velvet rope and a sign that read, "Renovation in progress, do not enter." "What is it, Max?" Emily knelt beside him, following his gaze toward the forbidden area. There was no sound of construction, no smell of paint or sawdust, nothing to suggest that any renovation work was actually taking place. Max pulled away from her hand and padded closer to the rope barrier, sniffing at the air with obvious agitation. When Emily joined him, she caught a faint odor that was distinctly unpleasant. A musty smell like old newspapers and something else she couldn't quite identify. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. Max looked at her with those expressive eyes, then back at the blocked doorway, as if trying to tell her something important. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both freeze. Emily quickly led Max away from the east wing, her heart pounding as she tried to look casual. Mr. Thornton appeared at the top of the staircase, his expression unreadable. "Exploring the house, Miss Parker?" "Just getting familiar with the layout," Emily replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "It's quite impressive." "Indeed it is. The Thornton family has owned this property for 3 generations. His eyes moved to the east wing, then back to her face. "I trust you found everything in order?" "Yes, sir. Everything looks well maintained." "I'm glad to hear it. Though I should remind you that certain areas are off-limits for safety reasons. We wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" There was something in his tone that made the words sound less like concern and more like a warning. Emily nodded quickly, her hand finding Max's head for reassurance. That night, sleep eluded her completely. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, which seemed more pronounced in the darkness. There were the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but underneath those familiar noises, she could swear she heard other sounds. Soft, scrabbling noises, like small animals moving around in the walls. Occasional thumps that could have been settling timbers, but somehow didn't sound quite right. Around midnight, she heard something that made her sit up in bed with her heart racing. It sounded like someone walking in the corridor outside her room, but the footsteps were wrong somehow. Too light, too quick, almost like someone was tiptoeing. She held her breath and listened, but the sound faded away, leaving her wondering if she had imagined it. The next morning brought more oddities. Emily was in the kitchen preparing Max's breakfast when she noticed that some of the items in the pantry had been moved around. Nothing was missing, as far as she could tell, but cans and boxes were in different positions than they had been the day before. When she mentioned it casually to Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who came in twice a week from town, the older woman gave her a strange look. Things do tend to move around in old houses, Mrs. Henderson said carefully, her Scottish accent making the words sound almost mystical. The Thornton place has always been particular. Particular how? Mrs. Henderson glanced around as if making sure they were alone, then leaned closer. There have been others before you, dear. Young women who came to work here. They never stayed long. Why not? Different reasons, I suppose. Some said the isolation was too much. Others, she trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Others what, Mrs. Henderson? Others said they felt watched all the time. Said they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about this place. The housekeeper straightened up as footsteps approached. But that's just old gossip. Pay it no mind. Mr. Thornton entered the kitchen at that moment, his timing so perfect that Emily wondered if he had been listening. "Good morning, ladies. I hope everything is progressing smoothly." "Of course, sir," Mrs. Henderson replied, but Emily noticed how the woman's cheerful demeanor seemed forced. "Miss Parker has been doing excellent work." "I'm sure she has." Mr. Thornton's eyes moved between them, as if trying to determine what they had been discussing. "Mrs. Henderson, I trust you'll have time to clean the guest rooms today. I may be having visitors soon." "Certainly, sir. Which rooms would you like prepared?" "The blue suite in the south wing should suffice." His gaze settled on Emily. "Miss Parker, perhaps you could assist Mrs. Henderson today? I'd like to ensure everything is perfect for my guests." Emily spent the morning helping Mrs. Henderson prepare the guest rooms, but her mind kept returning to their earlier conversation. What had happened to the other young women who had worked here? Why hadn't any of them stayed? And why did Max seem so protective of her around Mr. Thornton? As if summoned by her thoughts, Max appeared in the doorway of the blue suite, his tail wagging as he saw Emily. But when Mr. Thornton passed by in the hallway, the dog's demeanor changed instantly. His ears flattened against his head, and he moved to position himself between Emily and the doorway, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Mrs. Henderson noticed too, her eyes widening with concern. "That's unusual," she murmured, watching Max's protective stance. "Max has always been such a gentle dog." "Has he been with Mr. Thornton long?" Emily asked, kneeling to stroke Max's fur. "Oh, Max didn't belong to Mr. Thornton originally. He was Margaret's dog." "Margaret?" "Margaret Sullivan, the previous housekeeper. She lived here full-time, just like you do now." Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper. "She disappeared about 6 months ago. Just vanished one night without a word. Left everything behind, even Max. Mr. Thornton said she must have had a family emergency, but it seemed strange that she wouldn't take her dog." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Did anyone try to contact her to make sure she was all right?" Mr. Thornton said he tried, but he couldn't reach her. Said her phone was disconnected." Mrs. Henderson glanced toward the doorway, making sure they were still alone. "But Max has never been the same since she left. He wanders the house at night sometimes like he's looking for her." As if understanding the conversation, Max whined softly and pressed closer to Emily's side. She could feel the tension in his body, the way he remained alert to every sound in the hallway. Whatever had happened to Margaret Sullivan, Max clearly remembered, and whatever he remembered was making him very protective of Emily. That afternoon, as Emily worked in the garden with Max lying nearby, she found herself studying the layout of the property with new eyes. The mansion was isolated, surrounded by miles of mountain wilderness with only one road leading to civilization. If someone wanted to disappear from here, it would be easy. If someone wanted to make someone else disappear, it would be equally simple. Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked forward as he stared toward the house. Emily followed his gaze and saw Mr. Thornton watching them from an upstairs window. Even from a distance, she could feel the intensity of his observation. When he realized she had spotted him, he stepped back from the window, but the feeling of being watched remained. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, Emily gathered her gardening tools and headed back toward the house with Max at her side. She had the distinct feeling that she was walking deeper into something she didn't understand, but with each passing hour, it was becoming clearer that Max was the key to unraveling whatever secrets Thornton Manor was hiding. The third week at Thornton Manor brought with it a series of small incidents that individually might have seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that made Emily increasingly uneasy. It started with the photographs. She had been dusting the bookshelves in the library when she noticed a photo album that hadn't been there before, positioned prominently on a table where she couldn't miss it. The leather-bound book was expensive and well-maintained, filled with pictures of the mansion and its grounds throughout different seasons. Most of the photos were standard estate documentation, but scattered throughout were pictures of people. Young women, all roughly Emily's age, all photographed in various locations around the property. Some were working in the garden, others reading in the conservatory or walking with Max along the mountain trails. The photos were candid, taken from a distance, as if the subjects had no idea they were being captured on film. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The women were all different, but they shared certain characteristics. They were all alone, all appeared to be employees rather than guests, and all looked vulnerable in some indefinable way. The most recent photos showed a woman with auburn hair and kind eyes, captured in dozens of shots around the estate. "That's Margaret," came a voice behind her, making Emily jump and nearly drop the album. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her expression grave. "I see you found Mr. Thornton's photography collection." Photography collection? Emily's voice came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson moved closer, glancing toward the hallway before speaking in low tones. "He fancies himself quite the artist, always taking pictures of the staff, the property, visitors. Says it's for documentation purposes, but..." She gestured toward the album with obvious discomfort. "But these look like they were taken without permission," Emily said, studying a photo of Margaret feeding Max by the fountain. "She doesn't even know she's being photographed." "That's the thing about Mr. Thornton," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "He likes to observe people when they think they're alone. Says it shows their true nature." Emily felt a chill run through her. How many pictures had he taken of her without her knowledge? Had he been watching her through windows, following her around the property with his camera? The thought made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Henderson, what really happened to Margaret?" The older woman's face tightened with worry. "I wish I knew, dear. One day she was here, happy as could be with that dog of hers, and the next day she was gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address, nothing, just vanished like smoke." And Mr. Thornton didn't seem concerned. Oh, he seemed concerned, all right. Concerned about covering his tracks. Mrs. Henderson immediately looked stricken. "I shouldn't have said that. Please don't repeat it." Before Emily could ask what she meant, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made both women freeze. Mr. Thornton appeared in the doorway, his pale eyes immediately focusing on the photo album in Emily's hands. "I see you've discovered my hobby," he said, his tone pleasant, but somehow threatening. "I hope you don't mind. I find that candid photography captures the essence of a person much better than posed pictures." "It's very artistic," Emily managed, closing the album carefully. "You have quite an eye for composition." "Thank you. I've always believed that. The best subjects are those who are completely natural, completely unguarded." His smile was predatory. "Perhaps I could photograph you sometime, Miss Parker. I have a feeling you would be a fascinating subject." The way he said it made Emily's stomach turn. "I'm not very photogenic, I'm afraid." "Oh, I doubt that very much." His eyes moved over her face and body with an intensity that made her want to run. Beauty is often most striking when it's unconscious of itself. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat uncomfortably. "If you'll excuse me, I need to finish the upstairs rooms." After she left, Emily felt increasingly trapped. Mr. Thornton moved closer, effectively blocking her path to the door. "Tell me, Miss Parker, are you happy here?" The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something calculating in his expression. "Yes, sir. Very happy." "Good. I would hate for you to feel the need to leave suddenly, the way Margaret did." He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. "Some people just aren't suited for the isolation of mountain life. They find it overwhelming." Emily forced herself not to pull away, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I find the solitude peaceful, actually." "Do you? How refreshing. Most young women your age crave constant stimulation, constant contact with the outside world." His grip on her arm tightened slightly. "But you're different, aren't you? Self-sufficient, independent. That's what drew me to hire you." The way he said "drew me" made Emily's blood run cold. Had this job posting been specifically designed to attract someone like her? Someone isolated, with no family ties, no one who would immediately notice if she disappeared. A low, growling sound from the doorway interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Max stood there, his hackles raised, staring directly at Mr. Thornton with unmistakable hostility. The dog's presence seemed to break whatever spell Mr. Thornton had been trying to weave. "Ah, Max," Mr. Thornton said, releasing Emily's arm, "always so protective. Such loyalty is admirable, though sometimes misplaced." Max padded into the room and positioned himself firmly between Emily and Mr. Thornton, his message clear. The tension in the air was palpable, and Emily could see something like anger flicker across Mr. Thornton's perfectly composed features. "Perhaps I should continue with my work," Emily said, edging toward the door with Max beside her. "Of course. Don't let me keep you from your duties." But his eyes followed her as she left, and Emily could feel his gaze like ice between her shoulder blades. That night, Emily lay in bed, thinking about everything she had learned. The photo album, Mrs. Henderson's comments about Mr. Thornton covering his tracks, the way he had touched her arm and spoken about Margaret's sudden departure. A picture was forming in her mind, and she didn't like what she was seeing. Around midnight, she heard the soft scratching sounds again, coming from somewhere in the walls. This time, she decided to investigate. Slipping on her robe and slippers, she opened her door carefully and found Max waiting in the hallway, as if he had been expecting her. Together, they crept through the darkened corridors toward the source of the sounds. Max seemed to know exactly where to go, leading her through a maze of hallways until they reached the area near the forbidden East Wing. The scratching was louder here, accompanied by what sounded like tiny, squeaking voices. "Rats," Emily whispered, to Max, who whined softly in response. But as they stood there listening, Emily realized the sounds were coming from behind the velvet rope barrier, from the area that was supposedly under renovation. Max pressed closer to the rope, sniffing intently at the gap beneath the door. His body language was agitated, and Emily could see his muscles tensing, as if he wanted to push through the barrier. "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" Max looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, then back at the door. He began to paw at the floor near the threshold, his claws clicking against the hardwood. When Emily knelt beside him, she could see that he was trying to dig, as if he knew there was something beneath the floor that needed to be uncovered. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the house made them both freeze. Emily's heart pounded as she realized they needed to get back to her room before they were discovered. She tugged gently on Max's collar, and reluctantly he followed her away from the east wing. But as they made their way back through the corridors, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Max knew something important about that forbidden area. The way he had been trying to dig, the intensity of his focus on that particular spot, suggested that whatever was behind that door was connected to Margaret's disappearance. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Mr. Thornton informed Emily that he would be having guests for the weekend, important business associates who required absolute privacy during their stay. "I'll need you to restrict your activities to your room and the kitchen during their visit," he said over breakfast, his tone leaving no room for argument. "These are very private meetings, you understand. Corporate matters that require complete discretion." "Of course, sir. I'll make sure to stay out of the way." "Excellent. Oh, and Miss Parker?" He paused at the dining room doorway. "It would be best if you kept Max with you as well. Some of my guests are uncomfortable around large dogs." Emily nodded, but something about the request bothered her. Max had lived at the estate for years, according to Mrs. Henderson. Why would Mr. Thornton's associates suddenly be uncomfortable around him? As the day progressed, Emily found herself paying closer attention to the preparations for the weekend guests. Mrs. Henderson was working overtime to prepare multiple guest rooms, and Emily noticed several men arriving to set up what appeared to be audiovisual equipment in the main conference room. They worked quickly and efficiently, speaking in low voices and avoiding eye contact with the household staff. When Emily asked Mrs. Henderson about the unusual level of preparation, the older woman looked nervous. "Mr. Thornton's business meetings have become more intensive lately," she said carefully. "Lots of security measures, lots of secrecy, not like the simple estate management meetings he used to have. What kind of business is Mr. Thornton in exactly?" Mrs. Henderson glanced around nervously. "Investment banking, I think. Or consulting. He's never been entirely clear about it, to be honest. But whatever it is, it's made him very wealthy and very paranoid about privacy." That afternoon, as Emily was finishing her work in the garden, she noticed several black SUVs arriving at the estate. The vehicles had tinted windows and Colorado plates, but something about them seemed official, almost governmental. Men in expensive suits emerged from the cars, carrying briefcases and speaking into wireless earpieces. Max, who had been lying peacefully in the shade, suddenly became agitated. He stood up, his ears forward and his tail rigid, watching the new arrivals with obvious suspicion. When one of the men walked past the garden area, Max released a low growl that made the man stop and stare. "Max, heel!" Emily called softly, not wanting to create a scene, but the dog's reaction was troubling. Whatever these men were here for, Max clearly didn't approve. As evening approached and Emily prepared to confine herself to her room as instructed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend would bring answers to some of the questions that had been plaguing her. The secretive meetings, the high-level security, Max's agitation, and Mr. Thornton's increasing paranoia about privacy all pointed to something much larger than simple business consultations. But as she settled into her room with Max for company, Emily had no idea that the weekend's events would force her to confront the dark truth about Thornton Manor and about what had really happened to Margaret Sullivan. The weekend guests arrived with an air of secrecy that permeated the entire mansion. Emily had retreated to her room as instructed, but the sounds drifting up from the lower floors were impossible to ignore. Hushed conversations in languages she didn't recognize, the constant click of laptop keyboards, and the occasional raised voice suggested that these were no ordinary business meetings. Max had been restless all evening, pacing around her room and whining softly whenever voices echoed up from downstairs. Emily tried to comfort him, but the dog's agitation was infectious. By midnight, she found herself wide awake, listening to the sounds of the house and trying to piece together what was happening below. Around 2 in the morning, the scratching sounds in the walls became more pronounced. They seemed to be moving, traveling from one area of the house to another in patterns that defied explanation. Max's ears perked up with each new sound, and he began to pace more urgently around the room. Emily made a decision that would change everything. Despite Mr. Thornton's strict instructions to stay in her room, she decided to investigate. Something was calling to her from within the walls of the mansion, and she had to know what it was. Slipping on her robe and sneakers, she crept to the door and opened it slowly. The hallway was dimly lit by wall sconces, creating pools of golden light separated by deep shadows. Max immediately pushed past her into the corridor, his nose to the ground as if following a scent trail. The sounds from downstairs had quieted, but Emily could see light spilling from under the door of the main conference room. Whatever business Mr. Thornton was conducting, it was still in session at this late hour. She followed Max down the hallway toward the forbidden east wing, her heart pounding with each step. When they reached the velvet rope barrier, Max's behavior became even more agitated. He whined and pawed at the floor, his claws clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. Emily knelt beside him, trying to understand what he was trying to communicate. "What is it, boy? What do you want to show?" "And me?" Max looked at her with those expressive brown eyes, then deliberately nudged the velvet rope with his nose. The message was clear. He wanted her to go beyond the barrier into the forbidden area. Emily glanced back down the hallway, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was coming. The house seemed quiet, except for the persistent scratching. In the walls, which was now coming directly from the other side of the blocked doorway, making another decision that she knew could have serious consequences, Emily lifted the velvet rope and stepped into the east wing. Max immediately bounded ahead, leading her down a corridor that was noticeably different from the rest of the house. The air here was stale and musty, with an underlying odor that reminded her of old basements and forgotten storage rooms. Unlike the well-maintained areas of the mansion, this corridor showed signs of neglect. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and dust motes danced in the beam of moonlight coming through a grimy window at the far end of the hall. Max stopped at a door about halfway down the corridor, scratching at its base with increasing urgency. Emily tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door opened with a creak that seemed loud enough to wake the entire house, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The scratching sounds were much louder here, coming from somewhere below. "The basement," Emily whispered to Max, who was already starting down the stairs. "He wants me to go to the basement." Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings, but something stronger than fear was driving her forward. Maybe it was the way Max looked at her with such trust and urgency, or maybe it was the growing certainty that whatever was down there was connected to Margaret's disappearance. The basement was not what she had expected. Instead of a simple storage area, she found herself in what appeared to be a finished room with concrete walls and modern lighting. The scratching sounds were coming from one corner where the wall seemed to be damp and cracked. Max immediately went to that corner and began to dig at the base of the wall, his claws scraping against the concrete with determined intensity. Emily knelt beside him and felt around the area he was focusing on. Her fingers found what felt like loose concrete and crumbling mortar. "There's something behind this wall," she breathed, her pulse racing with discovery and terror. "Something you want me to find." Working together, Emily and Max managed to loosen several pieces of concrete and mortar. The scratching sounds were getting louder, and Emily realized with growing horror that they were coming from rats trapped in the wall cavity. But why would rats be sealed inside a wall? As more of the wall crumbled away, Emily's fingers touched something that made her gasp. It was fabric, old and damp, but definitely clothing. With trembling hands, she pulled at the material until it came free, revealing a woman's cardigan that was immediately familiar. "This is Margaret's," she whispered to Max, who whined softly in response. "I've seen her wearing this in the photographs." But if Margaret's clothing was sealed inside this wall, what did that mean? Emily's mind recoiled from the obvious conclusion, but she forced herself to think clearly. Margaret hadn't simply left. The estate. Something had happened to her here, something that Mr. Thornton had covered up by sealing evidence in the basement wall. The sound of voices upstairs made Emily freeze. Someone was moving around on the main floor, and the voices were getting closer to the east wing. With growing panic, she realized that she and Max were trapped in the basement with no other way out. "We have to get back upstairs," she whispered urgently to Max, stuffing Margaret's cardigan into her robe pocket. "If they find us here..." But as they reached the top of the basement stairs, Emily could hear footsteps in the corridor above. Multiple people were moving through the east wing, their voices low but clearly agitated. Someone had discovered that the barrier had been moved. "Search every room," came Mr. Thornton's voice, cold and commanding. "She's here somewhere, and she's seen too much." Emily's blood turned to ice. They were looking for her, and from the tone of Mr. Thornton's voice, she was in serious danger. Max pressed close to her side, his body tense and ready to protect her. Looking around desperately for another escape route, Emily noticed something she had missed before. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind some old furniture, was what appeared to be another doorway. Max seemed to notice it too, his ears perking up as he caught a scent from that direction. Together, they crept across the basement toward the hidden door. When Emily pushed it open, she discovered a narrow tunnel that seemed to lead away from the main house. The air coming from the tunnel was fresher, suggesting it connected to the outside somehow. "This way, Max," she whispered, and they entered the tunnel just as she heard footsteps on the basement stairs above. The tunnel was cramped and dark, forcing Emily to feel her way along the rough stone walls. Max stayed close beside her, his presence a comfort in the suffocating darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into another basement area, this one clearly much older than the one they had left. Emily found herself in what appeared to be a root cellar or old wine storage area, with stone walls and arched ceilings that spoke of the mansion's original construction. Wooden shelves lined the walls, but instead of wine or preserves, they held something far more disturbing. Files. Hundreds of manila folders and document boxes, all carefully organized and labeled. Emily's hands shook as she opened the nearest folder, using the light from her phone to read the contents. What she found made her stomach lurch with revulsion and fear. The files contained detailed profiles of young women, complete with photographs, personal information, financial records, and psychological assessments. Each file was labeled with a name and dates, and Emily realized, with growing horror, that these were profiles of all the women who had worked at the estate over the years. Margaret Sullivan's file was thick and detailed, containing not just her employment records but information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance, bank records, medical history, even copies of personal correspondence. The final entry in her file was dated just one day before her supposed departure, but it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made Emily's blood run cold. Comments about Margaret becoming suspicious and asking too many questions. Notes about her attachment to the dog and her growing awareness of the surveillance. And finally, a red stamp across the front of the file that read, "Terminated." Emily flipped through more files, finding similar patterns. Young women hired for household positions, surveilled extensively, and then terminated when they became aware of what was happening. Some files indicated the women had been discredited and forced to leave, while others simply noted their departure with no forwarding information. And then she found a file that made her heart stop completely. Her own name was on the tab. Emily Parker, current subject. The file was already thick with information she had never provided, including photographs taken of her in Kansas before she had even applied for the job. Max whined softly beside her, and Emily realized that tears were streaming down her face. Everything had been planned. Her hiring, her isolation at the estate, even her growing attachment to Max. She had been selected specifically because she fit a profile of vulnerability and isolation. But as terrifying as this discovery was, it also answered some crucial questions. Mr. Thornton wasn't just a wealthy eccentric with boundary issues. He was running some kind of systematic operation, using the isolated estate to conduct surveillance and control over young women. The weekend guests, the security measures, the secretive meetings, all pointed to something much larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. The sound of voices in the tunnel behind them spurred Emily back into action. They had found the entrance to the hidden basement, and it would only be a matter of time before they discovered her location. Looking around desperately for another way out, Emily noticed that Max was focused on something in the far corner of the room. Following his gaze, she saw what appeared to be another passage, this one leading upward rather than horizontally. "Another way out?" she whispered, and Max's tail wagged once in response. As they approached the passage, Emily could feel a slight breeze coming from above, suggesting it led to the surface. But before they could escape, she grabbed several of the most damning files, including her own and Margaret's. Whatever was happening at Thornton Manor, someone needed to know the truth. The passage was steep and narrow, clearly designed as an emergency exit rather than regular use. Emily and Max climbed steadily upward, guided by the increasing flow of fresh air and the faint promise of moonlight somewhere above. When they finally emerged, Emily found herself outside the mansion, hidden among the landscaping near the garden, where she had spent so many peaceful hours. The irony was not lost on her that she was escaping through the very area where she had been so carefully observed and photographed. Max immediately began moving toward the tree line, and Emily realized he had a plan. Somehow, this intelligent dog knew exactly where they needed to go and how to get there safely. As they disappeared into the darkness of the Colorado wilderness, Emily clutched the stolen files to her chest and prayed that they would survive long enough to expose the truth about what Richard Thornton had been doing to vulnerable young women. In his isolated mountain estate, Emily and Max moved through the dense Colorado forest with an urgency born of desperation. The stolen files pressed against her chest like physical proof of the nightmare she had discovered, while Max led the way with the confidence of someone who had traveled this path before. The moonlight filtering through the pine trees provided just enough illumination to keep them from stumbling, but every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. After what felt like hours of walking, Max suddenly stopped at what appeared to be a small hunting cabin nestled in a grove of aspens. The structure was well maintained, but carefully hidden, invisible from any road or trail. Max whined softly and scratched at the door, his behavior suggesting this was their destination. Emily approached cautiously, uncertain what they might find inside. But when she tried the handle, the door opened easily and warm light spilled out from within. What she saw inside made her gasp with shock and relief. Margaret Sullivan sat at a small wooden table, her auburn hair now shorter and her face thinner than in the photographs, but unmistakably alive. The woman looked up as the door opened, and her face transformed with joy when she saw Max. "Max!" Margaret exclaimed, dropping to her knees as the German shepherd bounded into her arms. "Oh, my boy, I've missed you so much. I was hoping you would bring her here." Emily stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what she was seeing. "Margaret, but Mr. Thornton said you left. Everyone thinks you disappeared." "I did disappear in a way." Margaret stood up, keeping one hand on Max's head as if she couldn't bear to let him go again. "I had to. If I hadn't gotten out when I did, I would have ended up like the others." "The others?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Come inside, quickly. We don't have much time, and there's so much you need to know." Emily stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind her. The interior was simple but comfortable, clearly set up as a long-term hideout. Maps of the area covered one wall, and Emily could see several different routes marked in various colors. "How did you know I would come here?" Emily asked. "Max." Margaret smiled sadly at the dog, who was pressed against her leg as if he never wanted to leave her side again. "I trained him to watch over whoever came after me, to guide them to safety if they discovered the truth. I knew that eventually someone would figure out what Richard was really doing." "What is he doing exactly? I found the files, but I don't understand the bigger picture." Margaret gestured for Emily to sit down, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on a small camping stove. "Richard Thornton runs what he calls a behavioral research facility. He targets vulnerable young women, brings them to the estate under the guise of employment, then subjects them to intensive psychological manipulation and surveillance." Emily felt sick. "For what purpose?" "Control. He's developing techniques for breaking down someone's sense of independence and self-worth, making them completely dependent on him. The research is being sold to private clients, government agencies, anyone willing to pay for advanced interrogation and manipulation techniques. That's monstrous. It gets worse." Margaret's voice was grim. "The women who resist or discover what's happening don't just get fired, they get discredited, their reputations destroyed, their finances ruined. Some are even committed to psychiatric facilities on false pretenses. Richard has connections everywhere. People who help him make problems disappear." Emily thought about the files she had seen, the detailed psychological profiles, the notes about each woman's vulnerabilities. "How long has this been going on?" "Years. I was his housekeeper for 2 years before I started putting the pieces together. The constant surveillance, the way young women would arrive full of hope and leave broken and defeated, the secret meetings with people who gave me the creeps." Margaret took a sip of her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "When I finally confronted him about it, he made it clear that I could leave quietly or I could be destroyed like the others." "Nice. So you ran." "I pretended to go along with his ultimatum, acted like I was packing to leave voluntarily. But I had already prepared this place, stockpiled supplies, created an escape route through the tunnel system under the house. The night before I was supposed to disappear, I gathered as much evidence as I could and ran." Emily pulled the files from her robe. "I brought some of the documents, including my own file." Margaret's eyes widened as she saw the stolen papers. "You got into the archive room? That's incredibly dangerous. Those files contain enough evidence to bring down his entire operation, but they also make you the biggest threat he's ever faced." "What do we do now?" "We get you to safety, and then we expose everything." Margaret stood up and walked to the wall of maps. "I've been documenting everything for months, building a case that even his connections can't suppress. But I needed someone on the inside to get the recent files, the current evidence of what he's doing." Emily joined her at the maps, studying the various routes marked in different colors. Why didn't you just go to the police when you escaped? I tried. Richard's influence reaches into local law enforcement, the state government, even some federal agencies. My first attempt to report him nearly got me committed to a psychiatric facility. That's when I realized I needed irrefutable proof and a way to get it to people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Max, who had been lying contentedly at Margaret's feet, suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. Both women froze, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. "What is it, boy?" Margaret whispered. The unmistakable sound of vehicles on the mountain road below made them both move into action. Through the cabin's small window, Emily could see the beams of multiple flashlights moving through the trees, coming closer to their location. "They found us," Emily breathed. "Not yet, but they will soon." Margaret was already moving, grabbing a backpack that had clearly been prepared for this moment. "There's another route out of here, one that leads to a friend of mine who can help us." A friend? Dr. Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist who's been tracking stories like this for years. She's been waiting for someone to bring her enough evidence to break the story wide open. Emily gathered the files, while Margaret shouldered her pack and attached a leash to Max's collar. Can we trust her? She's the only person I've found who can't be bought or intimidated. She's already published stories about government cover-ups and corporate corruption. Richard's operation is exactly the kind of thing she specializes in exposing. They slipped out the back of the cabin just as the sounds of their pursuers grew closer. Margaret led them along a narrow trail that was barely visible in the moonlight, with Max padding silently between them. The path wound upward through dense forest, away from the sounds of the search party below. As they climbed, Margaret continued to explain what she had learned about Richard's operation. "The weekend guests you saw are his clients, government, contractors, private security firms, foreign intelligence services. They come to observe his techniques in action, to see how effectively he can break down a subject's resistance." Emily shuddered. "I was a test subject." "You were supposed to be, but Max changed the equation. He was never supposed to bond with you the way he did." Richard underestimated how protective Max would become and how much that would interfere with his psychological manipulation techniques. "Max saved me." Max has been saving people for months. Every time Richard brought in a new subject, Max would try to warn them, try to show them the danger. Most didn't understand what he was trying to communicate, but you did. They reached a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the valley below. Emily could see the lights of the search party spread out across the mountainside, moving systematically through the forest. But they were searching in the wrong direction, following the more obvious escape routes rather than the carefully planned path Margaret had chosen. "How much further?" Emily asked. "About 2 miles to where Dr. Chen is waiting. She has a satellite internet connection and secure communication equipment. Once we get the files to her, she can begin the process of exposing everything." Max suddenly stopped and looked back down the trail, his ears alert. In the distance, Emily could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. Richard was bringing in serious resources to find them. "He's really desperate to stop us," Emily observed. "He has to be. If this story breaks, it won't just destroy his operation. It will expose everyone who's been working with him, buying his research, helping him cover up what he's been doing. There are powerful people who have a lot to lose if the truth comes out." They pressed on, moving as quickly as they dared through the increasingly treacherous terrain. The helicopters were getting closer, their searchlights sweeping through the forest canopy. Emily clutched the files tighter, knowing that these documents represented the only hope of justice for all the women who had been victimized by Richard's twisted research. As they crested another ridge, Emily could see lights in the distance that didn't belong to the search party. A small cabin sat in a clearing ahead, with warm light glowing from its windows and what appeared to be communication equipment visible on the roof. "That's it," Margaret said with relief. "Dr. Chen's mobile command center. Once we get these files to her, Richard won't be able to silence us or cover this up." Max barked once softly, as if he too understood that they were almost safe. But even as they approached their destination, Emily could hear the helicopters changing direction, their searchlights beginning to sweep the area around Dr. Chen's cabin. "They're tracking us somehow," Emily realized with growing panic. Margaret stopped, her face grim. "Richard has resources we haven't accounted for, but it doesn't matter now. We're close enough to get the evidence to Dr. Chen, and once it's in her hands and uploaded to her secure servers, there's no way to suppress it." They broke into a run for the final approach to the cabin, with Max loping easily alongside them. The helicopters were converging on their location, but they were just 50 yards from safety, just moments away from exposing the truth that would bring down Richard Thornton's horrific operation. Emily could see a figure in the cabin doorway, a woman with short black hair who was beckoning them forward urgently. Dr. Sarah Chen had been waiting for this moment, and she was ready to help them change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen moved with the efficiency of someone who had faced dangerous situations before. The moment Emily and Margaret burst through her cabin door with Max at their heels, she was already powering up her communication equipment and preparing to receive the stolen files. "You made it," Dr. Chen said, her voice calm, despite the sound of helicopters circling overhead. "Margaret told me what you'd be bringing. Every second counts now." Emily handed over the files with trembling hands, while Margaret quickly explained what they had discovered in the hidden archive room. Dr. Chen's expression grew darker as she flipped through the documents, her trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of what they had uncovered. "This is even worse than we suspected," Dr. Chen muttered, scanning the psychological profiles and surveillance records. "Richard hasn't just been conducting illegal research, he's been running a systematic program of psychological torture disguised as employment opportunities." The sound of vehicles approaching made them all look toward the windows. Through the trees, Emily could see the lights of multiple SUVs converging on their location. Richard's people had found them. "How long do you need to get this information uploaded?" Margaret asked urgently. "Give me 5 minutes to scan the most critical documents and transmit them to my secure servers. Once they're uploaded, Richard won't be able to suppress this story, even if he destroys the originals." Dr. Chen worked with practiced efficiency, feeding document after document through a high-speed scanner, while simultaneously uploading files to multiple secure locations. Emily watched in fascination as months of carefully hidden evidence was digitized and transmitted beyond Richard's reach. Max positioned himself at the cabin's front window, his hackles raised as he watched the approaching vehicles. The dog's protective instincts were in full force, and Emily could see him calculating distances and escape routes even as the net closed around them. "There," Dr. Chen announced with satisfaction. "The core evidence is uploaded and distributed to journalists, law enforcement agencies, and government oversight committees in 3 different countries. Richard's operation is finished." A bullhorn crackled outside, and Richard Thornton's cultured voice filled the night air. "Miss Parker, I know you're in there. You've involved yourself in matters you don't understand. Come out now, and we can resolve this situation quietly." Emily felt a chill at the sound of his voice, but Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He has no power over you anymore, Emily. The truth is out there now." "What you've found," Richard continued through the bullhorn, are confidential research documents related to a legitimate government-contracted study on stress response and adaptation. You're interfering with national security interests." Dr. Chen snorted with disgust. Classic deflection. When faced with exposure, claim it's all legitimate government work. I've heard this excuse a dozen times before. "Is it possible he's telling the truth?" Emily asked, doubt creeping into her voice. "Look at these files again," Margaret said, pulling out one of the psychological profiles. "This isn't scientific research. These are detailed plans for psychological manipulation and control. Look at the notes about breaking down your sense of self-worth, isolating you from outside contact, making you completely dependent on his approval." Emily studied the handwritten comments in her own file, seeing clearly now what Margaret meant. Comments like, "Subject shows independence," "Recommend increased isolation," and "Emotional manipulation proving effective, continue reducing self-confidence," painted a clear picture of deliberate psychological abuse. The sound of footsteps on the cabin's porch made them all tense, but instead of Richard's men breaking down the door, there was a firm but respectful knock. "Dr. Chen, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI. We received your transmission and are here to provide protection while we investigate these allegations." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. "The FBI?" Dr. Chen smiled grimly. "I have contacts in law enforcement who've been waiting for a case like this. The moment I uploaded those files, alerts went out to several agencies that have been tracking Richard's activities. When they opened the door, they found Agent Martinez and several other federal agents surrounding the cabin. Beyond them, Emily could see Richard's security team being detained and disarmed by what appeared to be a much larger law enforcement operation. "Miss Parker?" Agent Martinez extended his hand. "I'm going to need you to come with us for your own protection. Mr. Thornton and his associates are being taken into custody, but we want to make sure you're safe while we sort through all of this." As they walked toward the waiting federal vehicles, Emily could see Richard Thornton being led away in handcuffs. His perfectly composed facade had finally cracked, replaced by the desperate anger of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. He caught sight of Emily as the agents placed him in a vehicle, and for a moment his pale blue eyes blazed with fury. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," he called out. "The research we were conducting could have protected countless people from psychological manipulation by hostile forces." "By practicing psychological manipulation on innocent women," Agent Martinez replied coldly, "your research methods were illegal, unethical, and constituted multiple felonies. You'll have plenty of time to explain your justifications to a federal jury." 3 months later, Emily stood in the courthouse steps in Denver, surrounded by reporters and photographers, documenting the conclusion of what had become known as the Thornton Manor case. Richard Thornton had been convicted on multiple federal charges including conspiracy, fraud, illegal surveillance, and violations of human rights. His network of clients and collaborators was still being investigated, but several high-profile arrests had already been made. Margaret stood beside her, holding Max's leash as cameras flashed around them. Both women had testified extensively. During the trial, their courage in exposing the truth inspiring other victims to come forward with their own stories. "How does it feel to know that your actions have led to justice for so many women?" one reporter asked. Emily thought carefully before answering. "It feels like we've given a voice to people who had been silenced." Richard Thornton thought he could manipulate and control vulnerable women without consequences. But he underestimated the power of truth and the courage it takes to stand up to abuse. Dr. Sarah Chen joined them on the courthouse steps, her investigative series about the case having won several journalism awards and led to congressional hearings about government oversight of psychological research. "What's next for you, Emily?" Dr. Chen asked. Emily smiled, reaching down to pet Max, who had become her constant companion since Margaret had insisted she keep him. "I'm starting a non-profit organization to help women who've been victims of psychological manipulation and control. We're going to provide counseling, legal support, and job training to help them rebuild their lives." "And the estate?" "It's being converted into a retreat center for trauma survivors," Margaret added. "Something positive will finally come from that place." As the crowd of reporters began to disperse, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since arriving at Thornton Manor. The isolated mansion that had once seemed like a prison was now being transformed into a place of healing. Richard's archive room was being converted into a library and resource center, while the hidden tunnels were being sealed permanently. Max had played a crucial role in the investigation, with animal behavior experts testifying about his unusual ability to detect danger and guide victims to safety. The dog had become something of a celebrity, though he seemed most content when he was simply lying at Emily's feet, keeping watch over the person he had chosen to protect. That evening, Emily sat in her new apartment in Denver, Max curled up beside her as she worked on plans for the Survivor Support Center. Through her window, she could see the lights of the city stretching out toward the mountains, where Thornton Manor stood empty and dark. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, who was working with federal investigators to identify and contact other victims of Richard's operation. "Another woman came forward today. She was at the estate 2 years ago and thought she was going crazy. Thanks to our testimony, she finally understands what really happened to her." Emily typed, "But then that's what makes all of this worthwhile. Every person we help heal makes the fight worth it." She looked down at Max, who opened one eye and thumped his tail against the floor. "You started all of this, didn't you, boy? You knew what Richard was doing long before any of us figured it out." Max's tail thumped again, and Emily could swear. She saw understanding in his brown eyes. He had been Margaret's dog originally, but circumstances had made him Emily's protector and guide. Now he seemed content to simply be her companion, though she suspected he would always be watching for signs of danger, ready to protect her if the need arose. A year later, the Emily Parker Center for Psychological Recovery opened its doors. In a beautifully renovated building in downtown Denver, the center provided free counseling, legal advocacy, and job training for women who had been victims of psychological manipulation and abuse. Max served as the unofficial therapy dog, his presence bringing comfort to visitors who often arrived feeling broken and defeated. Margaret served as the center's director of victim advocacy, using her experience and knowledge to help other survivors navigate the complex process of healing and seeking justice. Dr. Sarah Chen sat on the board of directors, ensuring that the center's work received media attention and public support. Emily often thought about how different her life might have been if she had never taken that job at Thornton Manor. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also led her to discover a strength she never knew she possessed. More importantly, it had shown her that even in the darkest circumstances, there were people willing to fight for truth and justice. Richard Thornton was serving a 25-year federal sentence, his appeals exhausted, and his network of collaborators largely dismantled. The government contractors and foreign clients who had participated in his research program were facing their own legal challenges, and new regulations had been implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. On quiet evenings at the center, When the last clients had gone home and the building was peaceful, Emily would sit with Max in her office and remember the night they had escaped through the mountain forest. She thought about the courage it had taken for Margaret to prepare for that moment, training Max to protect whoever came after her and preparing the evidence that would eventually bring justice. "We did it, didn't we, Max?" she would whisper, and the dog would rest his head on her lap, content in the knowledge that his job was complete. The women who needed protection now knew where to find it, and the man who had hurt so many people could never hurt anyone again. As Emily locked up the center each evening and walked home through the safe, well-lit streets of Denver, she felt grateful for the journey that had brought her to this point. The isolated mansion in the mountains had nearly destroyed her, but instead it had led her to discover her true purpose in life, helping other women find their strength and reclaim their voices. Max trotted beside her, alert and protective as always, but no longer carrying the burden of being the only guardian against a terrible secret. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and healing was possible for everyone who had the courage to seek it. Dear viewers, we hope Emily and Margaret's story of courage and resilience has moved you as much as it moved us. Their journey from victims to survivors to advocates shows us that, even in our darkest moments, we have the power to fight back and help others find their way to safety. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of strength, justice, and hope. Please leave a like on this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human experience and the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that remind us all of the power of truth and the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Don't miss our upcoming content, and remember that your voice matters in our community of listeners who believe in justice and healing.